Welcome to the Tension Podcast. I'm your host, Donna DuPont, with the Archipelago of Design. Joining me today is Dr. Bruno Charbonneau. Bruno is the Professor of International Studies at the Royal Military College, Saint-Jean. He is a Senior Scientific Advisor to the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence and the founding President of the Climate Security Association of Canada. He is an intellectual, entrepreneur, and a team player at heart. Welcome, Bruno, to the Tension Podcast.
Hello, Donna.
So, Bruno, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It's been a while since we've talked about having you on the podcast. You have a really fascinating career. You're doing a lot of interesting work these days in climate change and security. But before we dive into that topic, tell us a bit about you and your career and how you became involved in climate change and security.
Where to begin? Well, actually, I've always been sort of interested in international affairs, secure defense issues, military organization, war and peace, that sort of thing. I even joined the Canadian Forces back in the day when I was 18 through the Royal Military College program. Didn't pan out, but I ended up there as a professor a few years later, as you mentioned. So I got into climate change and security basically a bit later in my career. I would say that I pivoted toward that issue in 2017-18 when I started noticing the rise of a narrative about climate change and security, where I've been working for almost 20 years, which is West Africa. So my work since my PhD days has been on basically the international politics of conflict management in West Africa, as I put it. So looking at the causes of conflict, but also the international politics of managing and trying to solve those conflicts. So international intervention from UN peacekeeping to, in the case especially the last decade or so, French intervention, EU involvement, Canadian involvement. So that sort of international or intersection between local dynamics and regional dynamics of conflict and international operation. And so in that context, having worked for especially the decade of 2012 until 2022 or so, I worked a lot on Mali and the Sahel. So the conflict that started in Mali in 2012, that was followed by a French intervention, then UN peacekeeping mission, and more in the years after. I started noticing the rise of that sort of narrative about the risks and possibly consequence of climate change for conflict dynamics, for war. And I always had this sort of sensitivity to environmental issue, but I'll admit that climate change was sort of my just citizen radar, not research or professional radar. But starting in 2017-18, that's when I picked it up a bit more seriously and I actually decided, I think it was 2018. It's a bit vague in my mind to make that pivot and focus my attention fully onto that issue of climate change and its consequences for security and conflict and so on and so forth.
Wow, that's an incredible backstory. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I found it really interesting that you were saying that you've noticed these signals a long time ago around the rise in this narrative of climate change and the conflict dynamics and what that potentially, how that can unfold going into the future. And I think we're seeing that now more and more today play out. And so I think this is a really important conversation we're going to have today around what that looks like and means for our audience, who this might be a new topic for. So I guess the natural next question would be, what is climate security and what should we know as defense and security professionals?
Yeah, that's a tough question. What is it? Well, I first maybe just in terms of definition, I like to distinguish climate change and security as a sort of the object of study that we talk about from the climate security lexicon, which I take as a field of practice. So climate security is a field of practice where you'll find academics, practitioners, and all sorts of people working around the issues that come up when we talk about climate change and security. So just, I mean, there are overlaps there, but I like to make that distinction. And so if you talk at the very basic level, what we mean by climate change and security is really about what are the implications and consequences of climate change on security. And obviously there are here two very important big categories, which is climate change, what it is, what it does, the uncertainties around it and the certainties. And on the other side, the term security itself, which comes especially for people maybe here in the academics in the audience, perhaps a practitioner to some extent, but certainly academics will know that it is a very loaded terms. Whose security are we talking about? Is it the security of the state? Is it the security of the international system? Is it the security of human communities or individuals? So human security. Or is it now, in the context of climate change, we're talking about the security of the environment or ecosystems? So terms like ecological security or even planetary security have appeared in recent years to expand the concept. So that confluence, if you will, of these two big concepts, climate change and security, makes it a very complicated conversation, if you will. But a very necessary one. But if we start at the beginning, like I said, what is climate change? Well, we're talking here about obviously the heating of the globe. So produced by greenhouse gases emissions that make the effects of which is to keep or increase the energy, if you will, coming from the sun. It stays on the earth instead of evaporating in space. So that's how the globe warms up. And this has consequences for everything if we think about the Earth system. So whether it's the hydrosphere, which is the term to say oceans, basically, the cryosphere, which is another way of saying the ice sheets, the Arctic, Antarctica in particular, the biosphere, so everything related to land, to fauna and flora, so the plants and animals, including us, by the way, and the atmosphere. So the interaction of these four big global systems is being affected. So each system is affected by global warming, and their interaction are being affected. And that's where the complexity of the whole climate change and its impact consequences on human system, on human life, and human activity becomes incredibly complex, but also very, I would say, radical in the sense that the transformation climate change brings and that we see and we can foresee are extremely important. And so I personally think we need to first start there to understand the very least what that means in terms of climate hazards, climate risks, climate consequences. And then we can go into what that means more specifically in terms of security or the defense sector, what it means for military organization. So we can, like I said, expand the concept of security, but for the purpose of our conversation, I'll keep it to that sort of more what I call hardcore security issues, so security and defense, military organization, and whatnot. So if we think about climate change effects and impact or hazards, we're talking about, heat domes, we're talking about drought, we're talking about floods, we're talking about extreme weather events, high winds, we're talking about all sorts of things, diseases, for instance, air pollution, and how do these things affect human activities. And in terms of security, especially in terms of military organization and defense, well, we can already see the impacts of those on military readiness, for instance. So it affects everything that military organizations are doing. We can talk, for instance, about the equipment, how the equipment is affected by climate change, their efficacy, but also what it means for procurement. So can you project what the climate will look like 50 years from now, knowing that developing new weapon platforms, for instance, takes decades. So what sort of plane will be able to fly in 50 years from now? Because that's exactly that sort of effect that we're talking about. climate change is changing the atmosphere, changing the density of the air. So that means it affects strategic lift. It means that you might need longer air strips and so on and so forth. We already have planes who cannot take off anymore because sometimes the tarmac melts and or the air the airstrips are not long enough, and so on and so forth. It affects also the salinity and viscosity of the ocean, so that affects the sonar. So the equipment, in that sense, is impacted in several ways. If you talk and think about climate change, we can also look into the effects in terms of force projection, so the very use of force, if you will. So whether it's in terms of access to certain areas when you have extreme weather events, your capacity to deploy troops. We can think about obviously the logistical chain and sustainment of logistics chains when it comes to responding to disaster, or when military infrastructure and supply chains are affected by such extreme weather. I've already mentioned the capacity or the effects on strategic lift. That's a big issue
Right.
for a lot of military organizations. So, and there are so many examples here. We can think about the effects of forest fire in Canada. We can look at the Greece that has seen military bases being closed down because of floods, but also munition depots exploding because of forest fires and that sort of thing. So it comes up with all sorts of headaches. And finally, perhaps it affects also people. So everyone, we're all affected, but for the military, they need to figure out what it means in terms of climate impacts on warfighter availability, effectiveness. So it affects soldiers. High heat weather, for instance, affects our soldiers' health. Climate change also, many people underline also the effects on mental health. So not only physical health, but mental health. So generally speaking, climate change is affecting and will be affecting warfighter availability. There are studies or people now looking into how it affects or might affect recruitment and retention of potential recruits. So what does that mean, let's say, to fight in the context of a generation that is growing in the context of climate change? So if you're 14 years old today and you look at climate change, well, what's the appeal of joining the forces, for instance? I mean, I think that's the question that needs to be asked. And for current members, we also see effects on their training. So training outdoors nowadays becomes more difficult, or the training days are decreasing because of, again, extreme weather events in particular. So there are all sorts of training effects, or effects on training, if you will. And all of these issues, equipment, force projection, people, and training, are all elements of how climate change affects security, and more specifically military organization. So readiness, in other words, to use that military language, is certainly impacted already and will continue, and will probably be even more affected in coming years because of climate change.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was a really real comprehensive description of just how complicated of a topic this is. And thank you so much for helping to make that distinction between climate change and then climate security and the security implications, because I think that that understanding the differences in language is really important, and that, as you described, these big global system changes, and then how it's cascading down in terms of hazards, risks, consequences, and then implications for military operations, and so in a variety of ways, as you described. So I think a lot of organizations, if they're not specifically military, there may be security or even other sectors, might relate a lot to these consequences on just ability to deploy, especially from an equipment point of view and then from a human point of view as well. So that's really helpful. So building on that, tell us a little bit about the type of work people do when they work in climate and security. What does that look like? You've explained a lot of the consequences and what it could look like in terms of impact to military operations. But what are some of those roles that people take on when they're working in this space?
Yes. Well, I focus a lot, as you said, on military organization, but I think most people right now, well, within military organization, people are working on these issues that I mentioned. But I think more broadly, if you involve or think about academics in particular, the questions are a bit different. I think the two key teams or things that people work on is first what is called often the climate conflict nexus. So the question as to whether climate change causes war, although that causal link is now probably not the best way to think about it or talk about it, but certainly the question of whether climate change will produce or at the very least contribute to more instability and perhaps violence and or conflict and war. So if we make the assumption that climate change is indeed, or we accept the conclusion that climate change affects every human system, so from food production, say, to energy, to transport, to health, and some countries are better equipped to deal with these issues. Others not so much. Others are already dealing with or are in conflict, are dealing with conflict, or are in conflict, or in at war. So what does that mean? So what are the limits, if you will, the tipping points where we might see climate-related violence? Related to that, there are people who wonder if climate change will lead to migration, mass migration, and whether those migration might lead again to instability and conflict. So that sort of space where people are wondering about the link between climate change, say, and violence or instability. The other sort of issue is the transformation of international relations or geopolitics. So, what does it mean for the international system, for relations between states and international organizations? So, that topic is huge, as I'm sure you and the audience knows. It is linked also to current events, whether it's the all sorts of elections going on and tensions between certain countries, ongoing wars, and so on and so forth. So it is tied to that. But in a more sort of medium long term, I think the transformation of international relations and climate change usually is a discussion that you'll see in terms of the energy transition. So, what does it mean to produce, or the need to produce alternative sources of energy, alternative to fossil fuel energy? What does it mean to phase out? Potentially, that's certainly what a lot of scientists are saying needs to be done. That's the Paris Agreement, phasing out fossil fuels. So the causes of climate change, in other words, right, moving away from those causes. So what does that mean for the global system? So if we take seriously climate change, we need to change everything we do, right? We need to figure out our energy system, our transportation, the way we produce food. So those are very big systemic changes and transformation. And obviously, such transformation can lead to all sorts of power struggles at all levels. And obviously, I think what we're seeing, for instance, between the United States and China is part of that. It is not only the rise of Chinese economic power, but I think we're seeing that China is leading the energy transition. It is the key producer of electric vehicles, the key producer of solar energy, and so on and so forth, solar panels. So that's part of the equation if we're talking about China and United States tensions. And I think the whole trade war, for instance, is also being here influenced by that sort of calculus about what is coming or what should be done in terms of climate change. It's not uniquely and only about climate change, obviously, but I think that's part of the conversation. So those are two things that also speak to what I was talking about in terms of the implication of military, because how climate change impacts instability, war, conflict, and how it impacts or transforms the international environment will obviously, it's another way of saying it changes the environment within which military organization operate or will operate. So what sort of, if you're talking about future or foresight, for what's coming for the military and so on and so forth, for NATO or whatnot, well, that's the sort of conversation that is happening, I think, out there in several places, whether it's academia, policy world, think tank world.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That was you explained that really well, because I know this is a very complex topic, and I loved how you really focused in on that climate conflict nexus piece, right? And because many may not have heard of that nexus point, and there, as you had mentioned, there's a lot of factors attached to that, like food, water, energy, and that has implications at the local level for people all over the world, especially with the rise in all types of extreme weather events and issues with damage and slow recovery from disasters and emergencies, and then of course that transformation of that international relations piece and that the political economic element. So when I hear you describe that system, there's this tension also between the need for collaboration on a lot of fronts regarding climate change and security, but there's also this backdrop of competition happening globally. And so that's an interesting tension point. So how do we navigate this forward? And I mean, that's a very hard question for you to answer, but what are your thoughts, given your deep knowledge of an understanding of the system? What's that first step in navigating this?
Yes, wow, that is indeed the question of the century, probably. And I would point to a concept that has become a bit popular in the last 5 years or so, which is polycrisis. Um, some dismiss it as as a buzzword. I think it needs to be considered a bit more seriously, in that polycrisis points to the interaction of multiple challenges, as you implied in your question, or you said in your question. So, and it also, the concept points to the incredible. I use the word radical, like the radical or radicality of the moment. Climate change is something that humanity has never gone through before, not at this scale and scope. We're talking about the transformation of the earth, and it will impact everything we do, including perhaps the way we think about human life, right? Or certainly there are all sorts of philosophical and political debates about what this means for the way we live and how we should live together or as a country at the international level, national level, or local level. What does that mean? So fundamentally, if I, for one, anyway, would defend the idea that climate change is indeed that radical. It demands new ways of thinking and doing things. And obviously, when you say that, you'll encounter people who will resist that, right? Will fight for either the status quo or take advantage of that. And so I don't have necessarily the answer of how to go about it. But if we think, and I've had those conversations with all sorts of people, obviously, not only within academia, but the government of Canada, NATO, and whatnot, we do need to figure out a way to have the capacity to think, plan, strategize, and do in terms of the future, long-term future. So plan and strategize and do things according to what we can see and where we want to be 20, 30, 50 years from now, while obviously recognizing the need to manage current moment, present crisis. And I think we're very bad at sort of trying to plan for the long term. And here, when I say I mean Canada and perhaps NATO allies. We're usually very much crisis oriented, current moment, very short cycle attention span. It's partly a lack, I think, of capacity. People are just trying to manage their inboxes and
That's it.
the current moment, the current crisis, the latest distraction, whatever it is. And, I'm not saying that some things need not be managed. Obviously, Ukraine war is obviously the easy example here. Obviously, something needs to be done there. It has been done, but you do have and probably should consider what it means to tackle and work through those crises for the long term. And the long term demands a different way of thinking and doing decision making, policy making, and implementing policy, for instance. And we could talk about different ways that people try to do that, but we need to build that capacity. Government, Canada, NATO allies, and beyond. Probably every organization, and you can even see in the private sectors or elsewhere, financial sector, people doing that sort of thing as well already, trying to figure out what will come. We cannot predict the future, by the way, but we can try and say this is where we want to be 20, 30, 50 years from now, and trying to navigate the present in order to reach that moment or that place we want to be. And that means being able to articulate the present through that future lens. You need to be very flexible as well, because obviously new data will come in, new crises will come in, and so on and so forth. So you need to be flexible. You need to adapt quickly. You need a way to figure out how to do government work in a world that's perhaps unpredictable, and it will most likely, if we think about climate change and public crisis, becoming even more unpredictable, according to some. And I would tend to agree that climate change brings that sort of the level of uncertainty at a point we've never seen before.
Right.
So yeah, we need to think about these sort of things and get ready for it, because otherwise, if you try to manage, I for one anyway, if you try to manage climate change from whatever sector you are, but certainly in security, in that sort of short-term perspective, I think you'll fail, because at some point there, if we take seriously climate scientists, adaptation, we need to adapt to climate change, but there is a limit to adaptation. At some point, climate change catches you, or becomes so big and important, the impacts are so big and important, you simply cannot adapt anymore. So let's try to avoid that. That's
Right.
what I would say.
Right. That's a really that's great advice. There was a lot of pearls of wisdom in that answer, and I think you explained it really well when you talked about the two different mindsets towards the future. I mean, I think it's natural. For humans, we really do focus a lot on short term gain instead of short-term benefit over long-term gain. And I think that's just a cognitive bias that most of us have. And so it takes a lot of effort and courage to try something new. And I think I loved your answer around that need for creativity and thinking differently and embracing change and new ideas, and that transformative lens towards the future of what do we want to shape and what do we want to create. I think that's very powerful and it makes a lot of sense in today's world that's really complicated, because I would imagine that we do need very different solutions moving into the future that we don't have today. And so we need to create a space for that type of innovative thinking across defense and security. Building on that, I would love for you if you could share a little bit about some of the work that NATO is doing in response to climate change and security and their role. Because I know you have you're very much working closely with NATO, the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence here in Montreal, and so tell us a little bit about that and what that's like, and what we could expect moving into the future.
Yeah, there's a lot being done. I think we're still in the early days, so it's a bit fragmented. It's hard to have the whole picture. Talking for myself. But yes, maybe just to go back a little bit, in 2000, so at this summit in 2021 in Brussels, NATO announced that it wanted to be the international leader organization on climate change and security. And at the same summit, Canada announced that it would lead in the founding or creation of this new Center of Excellence on Climate Change and Security, which started operating in October 23, I think, if my memory is correct, and was fully accredited by NATO last May, so May 2024. Or May or June 2024. So it is now an official member of that NATO family. It is still sort of building up its capacity. It is only part of a larger effort within NATO. So at NATO HQ, for instance, in Brussels, there are several people working on climate change and security. You can see that being built up somewhat at shape. So that's the headquarters in Mons, south of Brussels. So that's the operational center. Not quite there yet, I would say. Same thing with ACT, which is the other headquarters of NATO in Norfolk, Allied Command Transformation, that where you have the sort of foresight exercise, among other things that they do, obviously, foresight exercise about trying to figure out the future of the environment within which NATO will operate. I think climate change and security is an issue that's picking up momentum, but not quite there yet. Beyond that, you also have all sorts of like other centers of excellence, our institution. I think at this point, and that's only my opinion, but the momentum comes a lot from research organizations. So the whole STO, so that's Science and Technology Organization of NATO, for instance, through the Office of Chief Scientist, from the CMRE, which is a center based in Italy, and other partner organizations have been leading the effort to understand what it means to talk about climate change security for NATO. So I think at this point, if you look, because NATO has a climate security action plan, which has 4 pillars: so awareness, adaptation, mitigation, and outreach. So I think awareness is strong. And it keeps growing. So basically building awareness about what it means. So research and also spreading the word and the sort of thing we're doing, you and I right now, basically, talking about it, telling people why it's important, trying to convince those who need to be convinced that NATO should perhaps integrate climate change into everything it does. But beyond that, if I let's put aside outreach, because I think that that's not necessarily, it's something else, right? It's about NATO talking to other organizations. But in terms of adaptation mitigation, there's very little, unfortunately, at this point being done. So if we're talking about adapting military organizations for climate change, we're not there yet. If we're talking about implementing, doing things, institutionalizing climate change, we're not there yet. So you can see here and there all sorts of efforts. In terms of infrastructure, for instance, the NATO enterprise. So basically what NATO owns, so that's not military, which are under national government authority, right? Is trying to green or bring to net zero everything it does. You can say the same thing about the Canadian plan when it comes to its bases in Canada. But in terms of operations, in terms of adapting the military, all the things we talked about earlier in terms of force projection equipment, people, I don't think we're quite there yet at all. And the biggest, perhaps also hot potato, or almost perhaps in some sort of cold taboo conversations about mitigation as well, which is the fact that the military organization are also producing greenhouse gases. We don't have all the data because a lot of it is is restricted, not being made public. But the best average or the best estimates are that globally speaking, all militaries are responsible for about 5% of global greenhouse gases. And the biggest sources of that are airplanes and the Navy and boats. So and there's no solution, to be quite honest, at this point. Certainly not in the short term, unless you stop using those boats and planes. Boats will probably be easier to manage because they're big platforms. We already have some militaries, and we have nuclear submarines or nuclear boats and whatnot. But you can't put a nuclear reactor on the plane, and so we have no technology at this point that I think, not in the short, medium term anyway, that looks like capable of replacing fossil fuel use. And that's, a problem for the military, obviously, a political, moral problem, perhaps, because we say 5%, but if we think about, for instance, social technological transformation in the rest of society, so that percentage of greenhouse gases will likely increase as the rest of society transition to other sources of energy. If there is some form of phasing out of fossil fuels, those supply chains for those sorts of energy might be more costly or more difficult to use. So that might produce another sort of problem for the military. And who knows, 20 years from now, maybe in terms of decision making to deploy military forces, the general public might ask, well, is it worth the emissions that this will produce? We're not there yet, right? But I think this is the sort of thing we need to prepare for. Like, what's the future of war in a low carbon world, for instance? I think that's a question that we need to ask. And we're not quite there yet, but a lot of us are working on it.
That's great. And I think these questions are really important, and these what if questions make perfect exploratory scenarios of plausible futures that we can, put a military operations in the middle of that potential future operating environment, and really have a strategic conversation about what does this mean, like how does this change the way we deploy our resources or the way we operate. And it can be an opportunity to pull out a lot of really good ideas that might support mitigation, adaptation, even transformation. And so so hopefully with the work that we're doing around awareness, that we have more of that forward strategic conversations moving into the future, because I agree there's a need for it. And certainly, as we were talking about earlier in this podcast, there's a lot of complexities to the system, and it's fast moving. And so we want to be proactive instead of reactive, right, to these changes. But it does require, there's a lot of effort behind the scenes that goes into making these decisions. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. So that kind of leads me to, our next question around the future. And so we've talked a lot about the system and the complexity and the tension points and potential areas for disruption and what if. So when you think about the future of climate and security, what comes to your mind when you start to think longer term?
Well, it is about trying to figure out a way to plan for the future, as we discussed earlier, but in the context of immense uncertainty, or immense uncertainties. So the scale and scope of the uncertainties are increasing because of climate change. What do I mean by that? Well, and you can look into the insurance industry, for instance. You can look in other places. When people look into the future, most of our methods to do that are based on probabilistic statistics, so probabilistic theory. So basically, you look at past data, you look for pattern, and based on that, you try to look at what might come next or the probabilities of something happening again. But climate change is destabilizing the baseline that sort of probabilistic approach needs. So that baseline being basically the environment, right? The Earth system that we talked about. So you can predict, for instance, the number of forest fires every year, or the sort of rain pattern you can expect for food production and so on and so forth, or you used to be. And that's where climate change basically undermines all of those probabilities. And so it adds an immense layer of uncertainties about what comes next. Yeah. And then another layer of complexity and uncertainty is how do we react to that? So how do humans, societies, and communities will react to climate change? What can we do about it? What will we do about it? And obviously what we do and what we do not do will change or impact the impacts of climate change, if that makes any sense, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of a loop of very complex systems interacting, and their interactions are the results of those interactions are very much uncertain. So how do you predict the future when you don't have a stable baseline? Yeah. To sort of see patterns, right? So we know what is coming with climate change, increasing heat, the predictions on terms of climate change, in terms of, for instance, the impact of parts per millions of carbon into the atmosphere, what that means in terms of degrees of global average temperatures. That stuff is very good. It's very good at predicting. We know how much ppm means in terms of degrees of increased heat in the atmosphere and so on. So what we don't know, where it gets really complicated, is what I was saying, right? The impacts of that heat, increasing heat, increased weather, the interaction between all sorts of complex systems. So what do you do with that sort of thing? That's really complicated. Some people make all sorts of put all sorts of effort and hope in AI, for instance, to that will help produce that sort of possible way of predicting what's coming. And in many ways, I think it is hopeful for at least one part of it, which is the climate system and the Earth system. But we don't know how societies will behave and react to what's coming and what is already here. And we can obviously go back again to the polycrisis thing. So the way I like to put it is that climate change transforms everything, but not everything is about climate change, right? So it affects everything we do, but everything we do is not necessarily about climate change, right? It's the future of democracy or what we should do in terms of healthcare and whatnot. I think those conversations need to consider climate change, but it is not necessarily about climate change, right? So it's about your values or your principles, let's say, for healthcare access, or take any other example you want. And for the military, for instance, so it's about understanding possibly what's coming, how people will react, how states will react, how the whole international system will evolve. But it's also another thing for the military that becomes complicated, because the military is very good at thinking about, well, what will be the effects, or what is the effect of cyber and AI, for instance, for war, but very bad, I think, at trying to figure out what it means for their mission, what climate change means for their mission. And the other side of that question also is how the social technological transformation that come with climate change will affect the or impact the military, impact their mission, impact everything that we talked about. So, in other words, as climate change and its impact become more and more obvious, more and more powerful. I mean, we can debate that, but it will affect the way we see everything. So it might impact our priorities as individual, but also as communities, as national, as Canadians or whatnot. So that we'll see cultural change, social changes. We already see all sorts of very intense political debates, right, about climate change. So these come with effects, obviously, and there is also the whole technological side to climate change, and front and center in terms of technological transformation. We mentioned it before. It's the energy transition. So energy transition, it's not only about technology; it's also about power relations behind who owns the new technology. For instance, if you have a solar panel on your roof, for instance, you don't owe, once it's bought in place, you don't owe anyone anything. You're almost independent from, let's say, big corporation who own oil. Well, so what sort of political economic implication is there to that? And so that sort of social technological transformation, in turn, how will that affect the future of war, what it means for military mission, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple sort of connections and loop and interactions here that make looking into the future and planning for the future incredibly complex. But yeah, we need people to work on those issues, basically. And we need to figure out how to rethink the future and how we can work with that sort of level of uncertainty and complexity.
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining that. That is, I like how you just mentioned around rethinking and how to work with the uncertainty because, in your answer, you described different types of anticipatory thinking from a probabilistic forecasting, which is what
Mm-hmm.
we're used to a lot in
Yeah,
defense and security. And
yeah,
that works if you have stable parameters of change, you've got past data, and you're taking a very narrow lens. You can probably do those types of forecasts. But as you said, we have to take a much wider lens and look at a lot of different variables ranging, from political to economic, technology, social, and some of the ethical, probably, and legal elements that are coming into play as well. So it's a much wider lens and longer term. And you're looking at the evolution of these complex systems and how they're interdependent, right? And
yeah.
and so that requires a different kind of understanding, sense making of change, and really diving into the uncertainty, and but also exploring a lot of what if what if these were to emerge, and facilitating a lot of unique and new conversations, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when you mentioned forecasting, if you do and you've been to that sort of exercise within NATO or elsewhere, there's a lot of talk, for instance, about the future threats or present and future threats coming or risks coming from Russia and China, for instance, and whatnot. But I like to push back, saying, okay, but especially let's say the Arctic, that the Russians are supposedly were building up their fleet and they might invade the Arctic or something like that. And fine, you need to have that conversation, but you also need to consider the fact that, well, Russia is and will be impacted by climate change as well. And one of the things that some people are highlighting is that the thawing of the permafrost. A lot of the
Mm,
infrastructure in northern Russia is built on the permafrost. And so as this thaws, you're thinking and talking about infrastructure potentially collapsing. So railroads, houses, and also military infrastructure that could just collapse because the ground on which they built is melting.
right.
So that will obviously, if it does happen, impact Russian military effectiveness or force projection. And you can say the same thing for NATO, by the way, right? We've seen all sorts of climate disasters in Europe in recent years. I mentioned Greece earlier in our conversation, but you can look at Germany as well. I mean, I had an interesting conversation at some point with an officer. We were talking, I can't remember where that was, probably a year or two ago. There were some big floods around close to a German city where there was a U.S. base. I can't remember the town. I apologize, but there was discussion about rationing energy, for instance, because of the disaster and what came up, and it was tied also. I think it was the beginning of the Ukraine war as well. So we're talking about that sort of energy crisis at the same time, and then that U.S. officer lighted up and said, "Oh, well, how would that affect my energy?" A supply for my base in Germany if the German need to ration energy outputs. So it is affecting also our military bases in Canada, our troops, our equipment, our people. Same thing for all of our NATO allies, but also, like I said, China and Russia. And so when we think about that sort of increasing tensions globally, we also need to consider, and I guess to your point about the need for international cooperation, that for some of us who want to avoid those wars, those are points I think that can be used to open doors for that sort of, or possibly for that sort of cooperation and reacting or avoiding the worst because of climate change. Anyway, maybe I'm blabbing here or talking a bit too much, but I hope I made sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What you've described are exploring what if scenarios that are multi hazard, compounding issues, and you need to look at it from a variety of perspectives. And you have to really challenge your assumptions, and
Absolutely, absolutely,
be
yeah.
aware of assumptions that may not hold true anymore because we're talking about a very different context, right? So that's really helpful when we start to talk about strategic foresight and futures, and how that differs from traditional forecasting and probabilistic type of work. And there is an opportunity to bridge the two because they both provide important but different types of information, and they facilitate different kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
But I think this conversation was very helpful to understand where each one might live in the bridge between the two types of anticipatory thinking. So thank you so much for that. So before we end our podcast, we've covered a lot of ground here today. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience, for those that might be new to climate change and security, that want to start expanding their knowledge, learning a bit more? What are some initial first steps people should take if they really want to do more work in this space?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sometimes it does feel overwhelming too. I want to acknowledge that the challenges are immense. And sometimes it is frightening even. But there are lots of people working on this. And I think there is momentum, despite also, I'll say, the political context that we're in right now, where we see a few governments who are trying to backtrack or will want to avoid even mentioning climate change. Start where you can and where you are, right? It can be very local. It can be your school if you're a student. It can be within your ministry or your organization where you work. You can say, have we thought about this, about what's coming? And there's a lot of data out there, like whether it's Canadian research organizations in Quebec, for instance. UNAS has been doing great work on figure out or trying to make that sort of a foresight exercise for what it means for Quebec infrastructure. And I'm sure there are all sorts of examples across Canada like that. So there's a large community, but it is also a bit fragmented because the challenge is very big. So just find your spot that you're interested in, but you can start where you are, where you work, and have those conversations. If you want to go beyond that, well, you mentioned the Climate Security Association of Canada. So if you're very interested in things related to security, CSAC was created and founded because we wanted to provide a platform to bring people interested in those questions together. So it's very much an open platform to bring in academics, students, practitioners, policymakers, everyone really interested. It's not limited to Canada, by the way. We're having conversation with all sorts of people across the world. We're expanding or trying to expand fast because there is a demand. What I quickly realized, we officially launched it in March 2023, CSAC, but we started a bit earlier in 2022. And we what we saw is that we indeed were answering, I think, a need for it. I'm seeing the start of university programs in this space, but I admit that it's not quite there yet. But comment the CSAC, we're trying to certainly support that sort of initiative as well. We're in touch with different ministers of government of Canada as well. So if you're interested in policy, do reach out and we can put you in touch with others. We're having all sorts of events. I don't know if we can promote that sort of stuff here, but
No, yes,
we're
you
holding an
can.
annual event
Oh,
in
that's
May
great.
2025. Yeah, climate change, May 5 and 6 in Montreal on the climate change and futures of war and peace. So
Oh, fabulous. Okay.
you're welcome to be with us and your audience as well. There will be more online in the coming month or so. So yeah, you can start there. I think both. I would say start with your organization, then reach out. People can also perhaps get in touch with me on LinkedIn or through the CSAC website or whatnot. We're building that community, so don't be afraid of the challenge. I would say. Um,
That's great advice. Thank you so much for that invitation. And for our listeners, we will put a link to CSAC, or the Climate Security Association of Canada, in the show notes, so that if you're interested in being part of a community and to learn more about climate change and security, you can join the association and get more involved in the conversations that are happening across Canada and internationally.
or start your own community.
Fabulous. Yes, yes. People should be encouraged to start
Yeah,
their
you should
own
not do
locally.
that alone. I'll say that as a last sort of piece of advice. Don't try to do it all on your own.
Yeah, better to do it with like-minded people who are also interested and are passionate to see
Yeah.
some change moving forward. That's wonderful advice. Thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for your time today on the podcast, and just really sharing a lot of your knowledge and experience in defense and security for many years, but also the climate security and climate change, and I think this is a topic that a lot of people are. There's a lot of concern moving into the future. And so this has been very helpful just to get some of the foundational, at least a foundational understanding of what is involved, and some steps where people can take to get more aware, become more aware, and to get more involved. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It was fun.